What is your freedom worth to you? Each of our guests had a light bulb moment. They longed to live rather than merely exist. They smashed through their fears and programmed minds, trusting themselves, their faith, and their survival instincts, leaving the guilt, fear, oppression, and drudgery of their past for a brighter future. They took a brave and courageous step into freedom. This is their story of how they got a life. Welcome to Get a Life podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations. You matter, and so does your story.
Welcome back, everyone. I am Cheryl, and this is the Get a Life podcast, Ex-Cult Conversations. Today, we have Paul and Bradley joining us, and our special guest is Tom Grace from Adelaide. Welcome, Tom. Welcome, Paul and Bradley, for joining us. Tom is going to share his story on what it was like for him to be a part of the exclusive brethren. His parents were affected by Aberdeen and chose to leave in 1970 when he was 17. We are very grateful that you reached out, Tom, and it was perfect timing as we start heading down the split off at Aberdeen. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, and you can take us on your journey.
Okay, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be welcomed onto the podcast. I've watched a lot of episodes, and I suppose my main focus, if you like, is I think the title "Get a Life" is so appropriate really because isn't it? Since I left at the age of 17, I have had a life. I mean, it's 53 years ago. I turned 70 this year. So my family is Brethren heritage. My grandfather's grandfather was William Kelly. My grandmother, as I understand it, was baptised by JND himself, John Darby. So we come from a very like inner circle, if you like, of the brethren. And I can honestly say that my childhood was lived in absolute devotion to every possible precept or edict or rule or anything you like that the brethren said. That's what we did. Our family was just 100% committed. And whatever rule came in, that's what we did. And even towards the end of the 1960s, when things became a little bit very unusual, I'll say, we still maintained strict adherence. And I'm going to tell a story right at the outset to demonstrate that, which will have a sort of a bit of poignancy to it. So in 1963, the Lord revealed to Mr. Taylor, and I'm going to use my 10-year-old language a little bit here because I think that's how it happens. That those brethren who were keeping pets were allowing the pets to distract us from service to the assembly. And so everyone had to get rid of their pets. And if that was a sacrifice of a personal nature, then that was fine because the brethren and the assembly was everything to our family. Now, fortunately for us, we had a farm at the time, and fortunately for us, our dog had just, unfortunately for the dog, been run over. So we didn't have a dog, but we did have out in the backyard in a cage well away from the house, a sulphur crest cockatoo. They're an Australian bird, quite a large cockatoo, very intelligent bird, and they learn to talk. They have a very good personality, and he'd been part of our extended family for 60 years. So my grandfather had given him to my father to look after. And he talked. He was almost like a part of the family. When you walk past, he would say things that were quite unpredictable and almost as though he understood what was going on. Anyway, it never occurred to us that Cocky would be subject to this ministry because he wasn't an inside pet. We just gave him food. He wasn't, I didn't see him as any obstacle to our devotion to the assembly. But after a few days of mulling over the ministry and hearing how everyone else had, got rid of their dogs or cats or whatever they had, I could see that Dad was starting to get troubled about it. And eventually one morning at morning tea time on the farm, he said, well, I think it's time to let Cocky go. And I was Jim and my brother Jim, who's 2 years. I'm the youngest of six, and my brother Jim, 2 years older than me, and I were at home, and so we went out the backyard. Dad got the wire cutters and he cut a hole in the side of the cage. And I fully expected that Cocky would go to the hole and fly away and experience what it was to fly, probably for the first time in his life. But to the contrary, he went to the other side of the cage and huddled in the corner and stayed there. And we were a little bit bemused. We thought, surely he can see that he can get out. But he didn't. And he stayed there all day. The next day, we came out in the morning and he was sitting on top of the cage as though he was reluctant to leave it. He stayed there most of the day. The next day we came out and he was dead, lying on the ground next to the cage. And as a child, I remember it made a huge impression on me. I'm sorry.
No, yeah.
And I remember Dad saying, look, he probably wasn't well, and it's probably just a coincidence. But, on reflection and particularly given what we're about to talk about, when the cage becomes a fiction, those of us who've been trapped inside for so long find it really difficult to understand what it would be like to experience freedom and to go out and fly. And unfortunately, I know others who have delayed leaving the cage, who have gone through similar things in their lives, have not been a great success. And then I look at others who have left, like me, who left at the age of 17, and I've just had the most wonderful, superb, varied life. And so my motivation, if you like, in coming on to talk to you today is to say to people inside who are listening to this, get a life. Just seize the opportunity and get a life. And I'm going to back and fill a little bit to explain what I mean by that. But first of all, I think I need to go to August 1970, Saturday morning meeting in Adelaide. The meeting had finished. As is usual, everyone was standing up and talking and chatting. And suddenly someone picked up a microphone and said, would everyone please sit down? And that was a most unusual occurrence, of course. And so we all sat down and then proceeded, I think it was Jack Pearson, who is my uncle, by the way, said that some things had come to light that were quite concerning, and there were people saying things about Mr. Taylor that shouldn't be said, and that people should, that some people might have to be shut up, which in Brethren speak is kind of the first stage of being excommunicated, I suppose. One of the brothers who at that stage was quite a vocal brother who had emigrated from the UK only about 6 or 7 years earlier, called Harold Bales, then stood up and grabbed a microphone and started to say that something had happened in Aberdeen the previous week, and and he wanted us to know what had happened in Aberdeen. And he was immediately shut up and told to sit down and be quiet. And so there was like this big ripple went round the room, and then he was told to leave. So he got up and left. His wife walked out with him. Their 3 children walked out. And then another family had also immigrated from the UK not long before walked out as well, the Temple family. So there was 2 small families that walked out in a 500-member congregation in Adelaide. And of course that intrigued everyone as to, what on earth had happened, because these were people who were 100% committed to the Brethren until the previous day. And so ripples started to follow and people wanted to know. And then we were told, you mustn't ask, you mustn't talk about it. And then, of course, we began to hear the rumours about these meetings that had occurred, the fact that Mr. Taylor had obviously been inebriated during those meetings, and then that perhaps something had happened at one of the houses in Aberdeen. So, Bradley, you know probably more about the details of all of that. And I didn't know. I was 17 at the time, and or actually just about to turn 17. And for the next few days, everyone was in shock, and trying to work out why two respected families would leave suddenly like that. They had relatives in Scotland, and so they had.
Oh, so they would have got the stories from somebody.
They got the story.
Gotcha.
They got the Bales family got the story straight from Aberdeen, from Salt. They had a family living in Saltcoats in Scotland, and so they got information about what had happened. Then the Aberdeen notes got sent across to somebody, and my dad was given a copy of those. I didn't know any of this at the time, of course, because it was all kept very secret. Because, as you would know, if you mentioned anything like that, you would get withdrawn from pretty much on the spot. So over a period of about another month or so, there was discussion going on, and clandestine sort of discussions. And I could tell that my dad was having serious discussions with some other brethren that he knew, that he trusted. But I had no idea what was about to happen. And on a Tuesday night after the ministry meeting, we got in the car. And of course, those of you who remember, I'm not sure how many of you remember those days, but the meetings were just full of references to the beloved. And for my dad, who was a deeply committed Christian, he was finding that difficult to understand why we would be talking about the beloved rather than the Lord Jesus. And as we drove away, Dad said, "That's it. I'm never going back." And he was 61. And I passed that age a few years ago. And I remember thinking when I did, can you imagine at the age of 61, walking away from everything that you've known all your life? What a huge change that would be. All of your family, all of your friends. So I didn't believe him. I just thought, Dad's just having a bit of a spit. We went home, and the next night was the Wednesday night reading meeting. And then later that night, later the Tuesday night, my older brother Richard came around to see Dad, and they had a long discussion. And I remember Richard saying to Dad, "I'm going to leave as well. I can't stand this. This is nonsense. You can't have the world leader being found in bed with another woman who's married and say that that's okay." I mean, those things don't happen in a deeply committed Christian society where you have very highly principled people obeying the morals that are set out in the Bible. So I was somewhat staggered that Richard was married with 3 little children at that stage. And so the next night, the Wednesday night reading meeting, Richard said, "I want to go back and I want to tell them why I'm leaving." And I was like, wow, this is going to be something. So my brother Jim and I said, we'll come along. Dad didn't go. He stuck to his principles. He didn't go. So Jim and I, we used to be the techno guys that used to operate the sound system. Those people that used to operate the microphone volumes and those sorts of things. That was our job. Usually it was one person who did it. But on fellowship meetings or 3-day meetings, we'd have 2. But that night that both of us went and sat at the booth because we sort of thought this might be something quite spectacular. So the meeting went through and got to the end of it, and I thought, well, he's not going to do it, And then Richard picked up the microphone and he started to speak. And he just gave this address, which was sort of bizarre because it wasn't really part of the protocol. And it just went in circles around and around about, devotion to Jesus and how, it's important that Jesus is the center of our attention. And I didn't even see where he was going for a while. And then all of a sudden he said, we declare ourselves in assembly and I withdraw from iniquity. And he got up and started walking out.
Wow.
He recounted what had happened at Aberdeen in a very sort of oblique way. He didn't give details. He just said that it had been iniquitous. And anyway, he withdrew from the whole assembly and got up and started to walk out. And as he was walking out, one of the other younger brothers who was sort of, up and coming, grabbed a microphone and quickly withdrew from Richard as he was out the door. So withdrawal was at 10 paces. and Richard was gone, and Jim and I were sitting there, and we were just dumbfounded, as you can imagine, because our world had just imploded. And anyway, we packed up the microphone booth, and we got up and I went outside as quickly as possible to see whether Richard was still there, because, to say, what are we going to do now? But he'd long gone. So Jim and I were standing out on the forecourt outside the meeting room. And you know how it is usually, everyone would come up and chat and talk to you and that sort of thing. Well, there was a circle, I reckon, about 4 or 5 meters in diameter, and we were in the middle of it, and everyone was just avoiding us, And I thought, this is really odd. I haven't done anything. I haven't changed. What's going on here? And then one of these serious young brothers came over to me and he said, so what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know. I suppose we're going to leave too. And he just turned and walked away without saying a word. And that was like the first inkling of what was about to happen. And so we went home, and I think Dad and Mum, I didn't really think about it until we got home, but I think they were very relieved that we came home. Because you would know that, in a lot of instances where something like that happened, the brethren would get hold of the children and stop them going back, even at age 17. So we came home, and we were just in shock at the change in our lives. And so from that point forward, Dad rang Mr. Bales, Harold Bales, and the next Sunday morning, we went to their house and we had the breaking of bread at the 11 o'clock time. That was the correct time in the early 1960s. I can see Bradley smiling. And we started our own assembly, the True Assembly in Adelaide, which was what we saw it as. We saw that as, recovering the position and establishing the assembly for the Lord Jesus in Adelaide. And so there was 3 families, and then so we'd gone from a group of 500 to a group of, I think, 18. And that was our life for a period. But of course, we were so convinced that we were right and that they had lost the way, that we did things like we obtained all the notes of the Aberdeen meetings. We photocopied them we bought an old Gestetner machine and made a copy for every single family in Adelaide. And then we delivered them to every single house in Adelaide. I think we posted them all at the same time at the General Post Office in the city. And so they all would have arrived at the same time in post boxes around Adelaide. And we found out that the first people who got them rang the leaders, and then the leaders sent people around to everyone's houses to pull them out of the letterboxes and to try and prevent the story getting around. And then, we used to do things like we got the Aberdeen tapes, and we used to ring people up and play them over the phone. And we were so convinced that this was the end of the brethren, and, that they were all going to come and join us. And that was our life for the next number of years. And then the next day I went to school. And, of course, at school, I don't know if you can remember, this is not the brethren school. This is public school. There was no UBT in those days. So for my entire high school life, because I was in year 12, I was in the final year of just before you start university, supposedly start, which we weren't going to do, of course. There had been 2 other brethren boys in our class all the way through. One of them was the son of one of the high leaders, and the other one was the son of a low socioeconomic family, I suppose. And they walked up to me the next day and said, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I think we're going to leave. And they walked up. They never spoke to me again. And so you can imagine the school class, what they would have thought, because I didn't know anyone in our class because we weren't allowed to talk to them. And suddenly the 2 people with whom I talked the whole time didn't talk to me. So, it was a big transformation. And then we had to decide what I would do, going forward from that. And I applied. I wanted to go to university to either do law or dentistry. And Dad and Mum didn't want that to happen because they were concerned that if I went to university, I might be corrupted by influences. Because you have to remember that my parents were still 100% committed to the Brethren theology. They still thought that was absolutely one. And my dad never wavered from that right to his death. And neither did my mum, who died at 99 or something, I think it was. Age 99, that is. We then sort of went through a period of wondering whether what JT Jr. had brought in, particularly in the last few years, was correct. You know, were there things that, because of the fact that he'd gone astray so violently, or if you like, you know, obviously at Aberdeen, did that mean that he'd fallen into error in the last few years of the 60s? Mm-hmm. And so we started to unravel things. And the first thing I think we decided was that maybe the idea that you couldn't associate with family members who had left the Brethren was wrong. So it took us a long time, but my uncle had been withdrawn from about 7 years earlier. And after some months, my dad reached out to him. And so we started to resume relationships with them, and then they joined our meeting, and we ended up with what was called the Webb Oval Brethren, which is like I suppose very like the Renton type Brethren, in the sense that it was basically a reversion to the ministry pre-JT Jr., I would say. And that was pretty much our life for the next few years. So that's a very quick introduction to the Aberdeen view from the Antipodes, Bradley. I know that you have a much more intimate involvement on your side of the world, but that's how it unfolded out here.
What happened in the other sort of major localities like Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane?
Very few people left. It was well managed, I would say. It was hushed up, and so no one really found out what had happened. It was just kept quiet, and there was no. There was like maybe a handful of people left in Melbourne. I think there was a handful left in Sydney as well. And I don't want to be rude about anyone or cast aspersions on anyone, but some people left because they didn't really have 100% commitment to the Brethren theology, if you like, I'll put it that way, the Brethren way, the Brethren teaching. And they saw Aberdeen as as kind of like proof that they were right, I think. And that's why they left. So those people quickly became what we would describe as worldly in the Brethren. You know, they very quickly adapted to, you know, following a worldly way of life. Our family was very different to that. Our family was very, very cautious about, and the group we were with in Adelaide was very cautious. So every single decision was analysed under the pretext of the Bible and JT Senior's ministry, you know, whether that was something that should be done or should not be done. So we were very conservative. I suspect that some aspects of the Brethren are very different today to what they were in the 1970s, particularly late 60s, I should say, particularly what I've seen. But certainly the upheaval and the personal trauma that you would go through leaving would probably be much the same. And so it's not an easy decision to make, but all I can say is that I have never regretted it, and I have just had the best life. And what I'd like to focus on more in what I talk about in this podcast is the opportunities and the things that I've been able to do that I would not have been able to do if I'd stayed in the Brethren. I think, you know, I would have been like the cockatoo in the cage. Mm-hmm. And by now I probably would be so set in my ways that I would find it difficult to have enjoyed those things. So when I think I said to you, Dad and Mum didn't want me to go to university, but they did let me go to what was called the South Australian Institute of Technology, which has now become a university, by the way, and to do an engineering degree. And so I went and did an engineering degree, and I was a particular, you know, so naive and didn't really understand anything about the world. I'd never been inside a restaurant. I'd never been and seen a film. I'd never seen a television set other than in a shop. And all of these things were very new and very different to me, and it was a huge culture shock, as it would be to anyone. And those things, of course, are the same, I presume, today to some extent. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I went and did my engineering degree, and I didn't do very well at first because I think I think that I was just ready to explore, to find out what fishing was like, as in catching fish, camping, those sort of things, which I'd never done. But then I settled down towards the latter part of the degree and started to do a bit of work, and I did quite well. And then I got to the end of that degree, and I got a job with with the largest telecom provider in Australia. It was called Telecom Australia, then now called Telstra. And I worked there for a year or so. And then I went into the construction industry because my sister, I should say, by the way, there were 6 siblings in the family. Richard obviously left at the same time. My brother Jim was at the same time. My father and mother left at the same time. The rest stayed in at that point. So then my eldest sister, or second eldest sister, I should say, she was living in Victoria, and they left about a year later. They had a building business, and so I joined their building business when they came to South Australia. And then I set up my own building business shortly after that, and I had a very successful building business for about 20 years or so. And then in my 40s or late 30s, I think I suppose I should say, I went through a period where I guess it was of reflection and thinking, what if I'd been allowed to go to university and study law like I really wanted to do? And so I'm going to just talk about this period of sort of unsettledness, I suppose, in late 30s, which I think was about the time at which I started to rethink life and wonder whether it could have been different. And there were certain regrets. You don't learn how to date people. So for example, in that group of us that left, the 18 that left at that time, there was my brother Jim, who was 2 years older than me, so he was 19, I was 17. And there were 2 sisters who left. One was 2 years older than me, and one was 3 or 4 years younger than me. And I remember we started to hear about other Christians outside who were very devoted to missionary work and to converting people to the faith. And one of the families that left at about the same time as us was a chap called Robert Morton, who's a lovely gentleman, relative of ours. He had 5 young sons, and he heard of someone called John Smith, who was running something called the God Squad in Melbourne. Now, the God Squad was perhaps an offshoot of the hippie movement to some extent, where they were trying to convert bikies to Christianity. And, very sort of enthusiastic chap. And he was coming to speak at the Unley Town Hall, which is a town hall not far from where we lived. So I said to Dad and Mum, I'm going to go and listen to this chap preach. So I went to this hall, and it was 8 o'clock at night or something. And I walked in, and I was just staggered. There were all these young people there with their hands in the air, praising God and singing hymns. And I was like, hang on a minute, what's going on? And there's 18 of us that know the truth. And here's hundreds of people that are obviously really, following the faith, in love with Jesus, praising and worshiping him. And my goodness, didn't the girls look amazingly beautiful? I was just staggered at all these really, really attractive young people. And so eventually I thought I'd better go home. So I got home about 10:30 or something. And I remember I walked into the kitchen, and I could tell as soon as I walked in that there was trouble. And Mum and Dad were like, "Where have you been?" And I was like, "Oh, I went to this preaching and they were singing hymns and they were all praising God and there were lots of people there." And Dad was like, "Well, you go and get to bed and don't you go hanging around with people like that, staying out all hours of the night. Just behave yourself, and that's the last time you're doing that." And I remember thinking, "Oh my goodness, I am actually trapped now in a smaller group than I thought." So, cut a long story short, my brother married one of those young sisters, and I married the other because that was where we realised that was what our parents were going to insist on, and we were, very obedient young boys. So I suppose that was in part the cause of some of the chagrin when I came to mid-30s, late 30s, that I looked back and I thought, I wonder whether, life could have been different. And so I started to do...
Did you have kids by then? Sorry, just to...
Yes, I did. I had, we had 4 sons, beautiful boys who are now all grown up, of course, with their own kids. And I'm a grandpa 4 or 5 times over now. So I started to explore, if you like, what might have been. And one of those things was because of my Brethren upbringing, I'd never even learned to swim, never been to the beach. I didn't know how to swim. And I had an accident in my building business where I dislocated my shoulder quite badly. And then I had to have a reconstruction on my shoulder, and I could hardly move my right arm, which, I can move fine now, by the way. And I said to the doctor at the end of it, how can I best rehabilitate myself? And he said, well, if you just go swimming, that would be really good. And I couldn't say to him, I don't know how to swim. I'm, in my 30s and I've never been a swimmer. But I went and learned to swim, and I really devoted myself to it. And I became quite a good swimmer, and it actually fixed my arm. But as a result of learning to swim, then I thought, I think I'll learn to dive. So then I learned to scuba dive. And then I became very keen on scuba diving and boating, and I got really enthusiastic about all that side of life. And I finished up being a master scuba instructor and teaching other people to dive. And as a result of that, got into photography, very passionate about underwater photography. And then when you're doing scuba instructing, usually you work for a particular shop that sells scuba gear. And they said to me, you're a very good instructor. We love what you're doing, but we'd like you to be selling more gear to the students, more, scuba tanks and wetsuits and all that sort of stuff. So we want you to go to a seminar. So I went to this motivational seminar with this American chap was speaking. I'd never been to anything like this before. And he said to the group of us, he said, I want you to pull out a piece of blank paper and I want you to write on it, what would you like to be in 10 years' time?
Oh, wow.
What if you had a blank slate and you could just decide today, in 10 years' time, I will be X. You write down what X is. And I remember thinking about it and I thought, do you know what? I'd like to be a lawyer. I think I'd like to be a lawyer. So I just wrote down I'd like to be a lawyer. And he said, right, have you all written that down? And he said, yeah. He said, okay, so that's in 10 years' time. He said, so if you were going to achieve that goal in 10 years' time, what would you have done, say, in 5 years' time? And I was like, oh, I don't know. Probably would have done a law degree, I suppose. And so I said, I would have done a law degree. I said, okay. So if you were to get a law degree in 5 years' time, what would you be doing in, say, 1 year's time? Well, I'd be studying law, Okay, so if you'd be studying law in 1 year's time, what would you be doing in 1 month's time? And then he brought it back to 1 week. And then he said, now I want you to write down, not just your career. I want you to write down, your personal goals as well, your family goal, your spiritual goal, your society goal, and your career goal. So you divide it up into 4 things. And I've shortcut haven't gone into all of those details. But one of those things, for example, of course, was in terms of the spiritual goal, was I wanted to be able to explain to people what I believe and why I believe it. And I found that a really difficult goal to set, and but I did, and I have worked on it, and I'll come back to that shortly. But in terms of the law one, and here's another really good lesson that he taught me, I think, is once you set that goal and you say what you're going to have to achieve, say next week to get the month goal, to get the year goal, to get etc. You get to the end of the week, and if you haven't done it, have a look at what you wrote down. And you look at what you wrote down, you say, do I really want to do that? Do I want to do that? Well, then next week do it. And so for me, I'm going back to the law thing now. For me, when I got to the end of the first week, I thought, I haven't actually done anything. Do I really want to do this? I actually do. So I went and filled out an application form for a university to go at age, with running a business with 4 sons, and to go back to uni. And I got knocked back several times because my engineering results weren't very good. And I had to do aptitude tests and all those sort of things, I think. And eventually I got into an interview panel, and they interviewed me, and they said, how many hours a week can you devote to your law degree? And I thought, I've got a pretty busy life, but I decided I could devote 15 hours a week to it. And I got rejected because they said, we don't think you're taking it seriously enough. You'll need to go and do another degree first. And when you do that, then we'll look at letting you into law. But because I'd set that out in paper and because I was committed to the process, I did. I went and enrolled in a different degree, and I worked hard on it, and I did well, and I got into law. And that was, what was I, age 43, I think, when I got into law. And I loved it. As soon as I got into it, it was just like a breath of fresh air of, this is what I should have done first time round. And I've done quite well at it, to be not without sort of blowing my own trumpet about it. I've done quite well at it. I've got now sitting in an office in my own law firm. So
that's incredible.
So all I'm going to, and that's not because I'm special or anything. It's simply because I decided to go out and get something that is available. And you don't have to be particularly smart to do these things. You just have to have the persistence and want to do it. But it would never have happened if I'd stayed in there, of course, because those chaps that were my collegiates in 1970, like one of them, I'm not going to mention their names, but one of them is actually the leader in Adelaide, or has been the leader from time to time in Adelaide. Would you want to be the leader of the Brethren in Adelaide? Seriously, no. I mean, how constrictive would that be, to have a life like that? The things that I've been able to do, unbelievable. Anyway, so as a result of the scuba diving thing, I think that really opened the door to me changing to a new career and becoming a lawyer, and then traveling the world. I traveled all over the world scuba diving, took photographs in all sorts of countries all around the world, and I've just enjoyed the most, interesting life. And I suppose that the big question that people would ask is, what about the people you had to leave behind? What about those you left behind? And sure, that is a sad part of my life. So, when I left in 1970, I think my grandmother had died about a year or two earlier, I think 68 or 69, and she had 150 direct descendants.
Wow.
When she died. And of those 150, I think perhaps 5 or 10 might have left over the years. So the vast majority of my family is still inside, including my oldest brother, who sadly is now, as he would say, gone to be with the Lord. And I'm going to just talk about that for a moment because it's a poignant story, really. So when I in 2001, I think it was. So this is about 30 years after we left. And because of the fact that when we left, we were quite confident that we were following the truth, and that the brethren, once they found out about Aberdeen, would realise and change their ways. I'd always maintained the likelihood that we would all be back together again. But of course, as it turned out, JD Jr. went and died only 2 weeks, I think about 2 weeks after we left. And I think there were a lot of people, and Bradley, this is going back to your point about what happened in other cities. I think there were a lot of people in Australia who were very troubled by Aberdeen and were thinking about leaving. And I know my dad talked to numerous people before he left who were going to leave as well. And they were like, give it a week or two, we'll just see what happens. And then, of course, when he died, I think they thought, right, it's going to come back to normal now. We'll restore the truth again now that little, obviously no one would say it publicly that JD Jr. was an alcoholic and had led the brethren astray, but I suspect that's what they were thinking inside without saying it. So in around about 2001 was the first time that I thought, do you know what? I hadn't spoken to my brother since 1970. I think I did actually go and knock on his door when I got married, and we got a very unfriendly reception. But I thought, do you know what? I'm going to ring him on his birthday. So I rang I found out his telephone number. In those days, of course, there weren't mobiles; it was all landlines. And I rang I rang his work number because I knew the name of his business. And they said, "Oh, he's not here; he's at home." So I didn't say who I was, but then I rang the home, and it was engaged. So I knew that someone had worked out who it was that had rung, and probably recognised the voice, maybe. So when he picked up the phone, he already knew it was going to be me. and I said, "Peter, haven't talked to you for nearly 30 years. I'm just ringing up to wish you a happy birthday." And he was almost silent. He hardly said a word. And I chatted for a minute and I said, about the fact that I got married, 4 sons, successful business, having a great life, etc. And then it still wasn't responding. And I said, "Peter, it's 30 years since we've talked to each other. Haven't you got anything else to say about what's happened in your life? What's happening in your life?" And he said a couple of things about his family. He said, "Oh, I've got a lovely family," or something like that. But then it was just silence. And then he said, "Tom, you made the decision as to what you wanted to do. You've made your choice. I don't think we have anything to talk about." So I thought about that for a few days, and then I thought, do you know what? I'm going to write to him. So I wrote to him and I said, "You've said that I made my choice. You need to remember that I was 17. I didn't actually make any choice. My parents made the choice. Dad and Mum made the choice. I left. I'm an evidence-based person, particularly now that I'm at this stage of my life, because by then I was a lawyer. I'd like you to tell me the facts about Aberdeen. And if you've got a story about Aberdeen that's different to what I've heard, because I always believe in getting both sides of a story. One of the things you learn as a lawyer is there's always 2 sides to a story. You tell me what the story is that you've got." And I got back a letter which was just bizarre. It took 2 months. But basically it was a letter that came back that said, "As to Aberdeen, the facts are the facts." Let me just see if I've got his letter here. I'll see if I can find it. So I've got the letter here. I probably, it wouldn't probably be appropriate to put it publicly on the screen, given that it's a personal letter from him, even though he's now no longer with us. But he just says, regarding Aberdeen, there isn't any more to tell as to facts, capital FACTS. other than what was clearly stated by Mr. J. Taylor Jr. in his letter, which was circulated under his direction at the time. So basically, he's going back to the letter. Those letters we've all seen now. And then he goes on to say there was supposition and imputation added to it with falsehoods, and you can't accept anything against an elder unless there's 2 or 3 witnesses. But then he goes on to say there was a build-up, and Mr. Taylor's provocative speaking leading up to this ambush caused the bringing into the open of the secret reserves against the purity of our beloved brother and unfaithfulness to the Lord. Now, I have cross-examined a number of people in court, and I wanted to cross-examine him about that letter, but I just couldn't do it. I wrote a reply and then I never even sent it because it's such a pathetic attempt. Why would you talk about warning of an ambush coming? That's just the complete contradiction to an ambush. And the concept of it being an ambush is just ridiculous, Clearly what happened is the man became addicted to alcohol, lost his sense of judgment, and presumably fell in love with a woman, and took advantage of his position of power. And those sort of things happen in the wider society quite frequently, but they're not appropriate for a what I'll call a church, which it supposedly follows the moral principles that are set out in the Bible. And so it was just clearly wrong. And he concluded his letter by saying, if I seriously wish to reconsider the course, then he'd be glad to communicate further. So that, to me, that was a very strange response. The letter in itself has a number of internal inconsistencies, and I just thought, I'm just going to leave that where it is. But just to finish on that, a number of years later, I think about 3 or 4 years later, I'm not sure of the exact timing of this, there was a news report about a young boy being killed in an accident, and it sounded very much like it might have been an accident that occurred at my brother's workplace. So I called him up because I thought it was very likely his grandson who died, because what happened was there was he had a machinery business, and a 6-year-old boy had climbed inside a machine, and no one had known he was there, and then it crushed him to death. That's as I understand the report. So I felt very sorry for him, if something like that had happened at his workplace. It's a terrible accident to happen. And I rang him up to express, and I said, I just wanted to ring you up and say, I'm really sorry to hear about that, and I realise what how difficult that must be for you and your family. And he's was, I think he might have said thank you, but he didn't say anything else much. We chatted for perhaps a minute or two. And then about a month later, I got a phone call from his oldest son saying that he died. And, a couple of weeks, like 2 weeks after our phone call. And I said, really? I said, I rang him only a month ago. This must have been quite sudden. And he said, no, he had asbestosis. So he when I spoke to him, he was right close to death.
Wow.
And never even mentioned that he was ill. And I was just devastated. It would have been so nice to have been able to say thank you for being a good brother, etc., and say goodbye. But that's the harshness of a system that puts rules around people in this way.
Comes back to what we were saying about emotions, Cheryl, as well.
What was that?
Yeah.
Well, we were talking about emotions and just how they just can't express emotions, and it isn't the thing to do. They just have to stiff up a lip and just get on with
exactly
life
right.
and don't.
Particularly with,
Sorry, what was that, Bradley?
particularly with family.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
Almost more so than other people.
we since that time, I suppose, and at about that time, because my first marriage eventually didn't last, and I would fully accept responsibility for that on my side, because I, as I said, never having dated, etc., I fell madly and deeply in love with somebody, and etc. And I'm not going to go into those details, but I do have. I did remarry, and then I have a beautiful daughter. And when she was born, of course, by that stage, there were no restrictions, and I had this photograph of her sitting on a park bench with 6 of her friends from kindergarten, when we'd been to the local park or something, and they were all, sitting together. And I remember it just triggered something in my mind, thinking, that is something I will never have, because all of my compatriot people that I grew up with are no longer part of my life. And I went through what I would call, around about my 50s, I suppose, an episode of PTSD for a while, where I was mystified, if you like, as to why I would suddenly burst into tears. I had no idea. I mean, I'm a successful lawyer. I'd be driving down the road and I'd just burst into tears. So I finished having therapy for that. And lovely psychologist eventually said to me one day, "Do you know, Tom, I think there's a part of you that wishes you'd never left." And I initially was quite dismissive about that. I thought, that's rubbish. I have no regrets about leaving whatsoever. And then she said to me, "Well, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to bring that out into the open in your mind. And so write a letter to yourself as that 17-year-old. The first letter is why you should have stayed. And the second letter is why you should have left." And it took me a couple of weeks to decide to actually do what she said, because I thought it sounded a ridiculous idea, but I did it. And the odd thing is that when I started to write the letter about why I should have stayed, I just fell into brethren speak in about an instant. And I could come up with all these catchphrases as to, implanted deep in my psyche is all this stuff about, following the truth and, not losing the way and holding on, and et cetera, et cetera. And I got to the end of it and I thought, what a load of rubbish. Why is that actually bothering me? This is just so wrong. And then when I wrote the other letter about why I should have left, it was so clear. And it was a really good cleansing process for me to confront that and to realize that. And I suspect this is the same for people who don't actually make the decision to leave themselves, but their parents ask them or take them to leave.
Yeah, or people who are pushed out. Like, I'm actually going to do this exercise, because what a cleansing exercise when you felt like you didn't have a choice. I mean, we know on the outside, we know that we value the freedom we have now. But I agree that when you don't have a choice, whether you're forced out or your parents make that choice, there's a part of us that is stuck back there in absolute hiatus.
Yeah. And there is this thing, where if you're a committed and absolutely rule-following person that's prepared to turn the corner when the Lord turns a corner and follow the cloud, or whatever language you want to talk about, and do everything the brethren says on the inside, and you don't actually care about having a life, let's put it that way, you do have a cradle to the grave social blanket around you that looks after you. I mean, there is no doubt about the fact that the payoff for not having a life is that you do get this umbrella of care. And I'm not sure whether it applies so much today. I don't know, but certainly, I'll give you an example. When I was 16, in Australia, you get your driving license when you're 16, and I was 16 years and 3 months old, and I had my license, and I had a very, very serious car accident, came through the light. The traffic lights were green, and as I came through the traffic lights, I saw this sporty vehicle coming at high speed through a red light, almost a head-on accident. I hit the seatbelt so hard that I had bleeding from the seatbelt.
Wow.
And my mother, who was sitting next to me in the car, was thrown out of the vehicle, and this is before we left. And she was, I think she had a broken leg and a head injury, and the ambulance came with sirens blaring and took her to hospital, etc. But as you would know in the Brethren, people only stay in hospital when they absolutely have to because of the eating matter, because you're not allowed to eat with others. So the Brethren safety net stepped in, and she was taken from hospital the next morning to stay. In those days, one of the leading brothers was a doctor, and stayed in his house and cared for. And the Brethren safety net just came around our family in a lovely way. There is no doubt about that. And when you're inside, of course, you think that would be my safety net, and no one else could provide that. But that's not the case at all. And I remember the first time I realised that was actually when I began scuba diving. I remember sitting on a beach. You have to remember that it took me 20 years really to change my Brethren mentality. I was probably in my late 30s by this stage, and until then I'd pretty much slavishly followed most of the Brethren rules, say pre-JT junior rules anyway. I remember sitting on a beach with these chaps that we were doing our dive master training, where you do all these sort of very difficult exercises where you have to, swim long distances against weights and currents and all that sort of thing. And these chaps were talking, and one of them said, I've got to move house on the weekend. And they all said, we'll come around and help it. And I suddenly realised that in the wider community outside the Brethren, there is actually a genuine sense of love and caring and affection in the normal psyche of a human, is to care for each other. That's what humans are like. They do that.
Yeah.
And you can build a group very quickly just by being a caring individual. You'll attract caring individuals. So the fact that the Brethren provide that sort of a net is not at all unique. But if you stay in the Brethren to keep that, you'll never have a life.
Would you, and just to jump in quickly, I've not had much personal experience of it, but I think often like sports clubs and other kind of clubs, you often get a kind of similar kind of sense of community. Yes. in those groups, don't you? And people looking out for each other. So that's just something, for people to be aware of.
That's right. And there are so many different groups like that that are open to people to belong to. And I've got a group around me in my own law firm that care about me, and I've got a family, a community where we live. My wife and I live on a beautiful farm in the Adelaide Hills, and and our neighbours are just marvellous. They're just wonderful people, and we can, if anything happens, we can just call on the phone and they'll be there in 30 seconds. My wife had a medical episode a few months ago, and the neighbours up the road are doctors, and they were there within a minute, and they would do anything for us. So this community thing, which because you're in the Brethren and you're cut off from society, you think is entirely Brethren driven. It's not at all.
No,
there are wide nets outside that care for people as well.
I experienced it when my husband, he had a heart attack and had to have an artificial heart, and while we're waiting for a heart transplant, and I had the community all over our city came to us. There was an article written about him. I hope those insiders that are listening to this really take it to heart that this is everywhere. It's not just within within the PPCC, and that
No.
that blanket of love can come from, you follow your passion when you just get involved in, I mean, it can come from going to a pottery class, right? It just naturally, humans want to do that. They want to be they want to be together. They want to be connected.
That's right. Absolutely. And the other thing, which I was slightly hesitant to talk about this aspect, I went through a phase with my building company which was very successful, and I was getting close to ready to retire at about age 40. And what I intended to do was to become a full-time pastor in a church on a volunteer basis, basically attempting to persuade people to become Christians. And leading, following the truth as I understood it to be at that stage. And I decided to go and study theology. So I went and did a theology degree, and that was a really interesting part of my life, because I was deeply involved in that church community, which is another example of what the safety net that you would have in the Brethren in a church community. And they were lovely, lovely people who cared and operated as one big family. I have to say, a much closer family than the Brethren family. We would have meals together, very similar to the Brethren entertaining, but there's no pressure to do it in a certain way or anything. It's just all very relaxed and so on. And I went through a whole period where I was, a leader in a church, involved in evangelism and preaching and so on. Really a replacement, if you like, of the Brethren community, and they're everywhere. So it's not only in sporting communities; it's also in church communities. And so it really, you can choose. Once you're outside the Brethren, you can choose which way you want to go. If you want to go down one of those paths, they're totally welcoming to you.
Or do multiple. You can be involved in a church and in a sporting community.
Absolutely.
Correct. And I was at that time. Exactly right. I was at that time. I had a big dive boat and involved in a sporting diving club, and at the same time used to take the youth group from the church out on the same boat. So
yeah, the thing in reflecting back on it about being inside was the conditionality of the relationships. Everything was conditional. Yes. And secondarily, everything was subject to somebody saying it was okay or not okay. Like, you couldn't just go and visit someone, or you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, because someone had to approve it. And everything was all based on, it was all conditional. Whereas outside, people just care about you because they care about you, or they take
That's a really good point. That is a really good point. Is that it is, you have to like everybody in there, right? You can't get away from them. We're out here. You get to choose. You get to choose that blanket of love that we've talked about.
And you're embraced and enfolded by people just for being you.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's not because you're a member of a church or a sporting group or something. There's people that just like you or care about you, or your neighbors, like you mentioned, Tom.
Correct.
It's about the goodness inside of people. It's not like on the inside we didn't know that.
It's more genuine, really, then, isn't it? It's not forced.
It's real. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. That's a really good point, Paul, because inside, you're told who you can be friends with. There is a limitation, and you can't be friends with anyone outside the Brethren, obviously. But not only that, as I understand it, particularly nowadays, there's limitations on who you're allowed to entertain and etc., and limitations on who you can marry, and all those sorts of strange rules. One of the things that really struck me, I've just yesterday received my copy of Craig Hoyle's book, and I haven't yet had the opportunity to read more than about a page or so. But one of the things that really struck me about Craig's story is that he fully believed that Bruce Hales would be able to do sort of miraculous things for him, and somebody else I read of recently that said, that Bruce apparently says that he can look at you and in 5 seconds can work out what's inside your soul or something like that. What a ridiculous set of propositions. This is a very flawed human. This is a very flawed human, and to think that would somehow or other and give him the power to do these things to change a person from being homosexual to straight. Very strange, group of people that you're forced to associate with, whereas outside there is no such constriction on that. If you were to meet someone who made those sort of claims outside, you would just think they were really odd and walk away and be friends with someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is they talk so much about the work of God in you, not quenching the Spirit's work of God, not quenching the work of God in you and embracing that. But the whole practice is a denial of it. Looking back on sort of my priestly visits, that was one of the things I said is like, if you believe God is omnipotent, and they're like, oh yes, definitely omnipotent. Well, in you feel that God, everything God is doing. No, we couldn't embrace the bread. Well, how can you say then that God isn't working in me differently than He's working in you?
Yes,
and there was just this kind of weird mumbling and grumbling, and just kind of brushed by that very quickly. But if you are a Christian, you believe, then you realize you can't put those strictures or those sort of boundaries on.
Yes.
On another believer.
There's one topic that I would like to point out for people who might be listening to this. The concept of a religion which stays fairly stable over a long period of time really arises largely because of the text that follows. And I'm speaking now, I'm not speaking just about Christianity here. I'm speaking like, Islam, for example, has the Quran. Christianity has the Bible. Now, I remember one of the seminal changes that occurred in 1970 was the very first time it was said that what Jim Taylor says is equal in importance to the Bible. Mm-hmm. Now, and as I understand it, that's become a very clearly accepted truth now, that, what Bruce says, his interpretation, obviously it's always in his language, based on an interpretation of the Bible. But what he says about that interpretation is the final version of it. That automatically leads to instability and unpredictability about the future. Because as soon as you say, we are not going to follow the textbook that has been the textbook for 1,500, 2,000 years for Christianity, we're now going to allow an individual to decide what is right and what is wrong. You aren't going to maintain a cohesive direction. You're going to be wandering in all sorts of directions if you do that. And I think it's a huge change that has occurred since 1970, since that first edict came out about the words of the beloved are of equal importance to the biblical text. And whatever you might think about, the authority of the Bible as the word of God, the fact is that as soon as you say it's up to Bruce to decide what we do, then who knows where you're going to go next. Mm-hmm. You can so easily end up with a Jim Jones type
100%. Yeah. And I think that's what he's created. He's created for himself the exact replica of that, of where he has all these people underneath his thumb that, those that don't see through it totally absolutely believe that he's the Paul. He's Paul, right?
Yeah.
No, what you were saying about that under JT Jr., JT ministered about revealed light in the temple being equivalent to Scripture, but that was I think that set the stage for it, but that was more of a community sort of thing, and then it evolved from that into, the big cheese saying what's up.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I mean, I have my own views about the whole concept that Darby started with, in terms of his interpretations of separation from evil and so on. I think, to me, that was the if you like, the seed which has caused things to become poisoned. Because you've cloistered yourself away from the mainstream common sense of Christianity, which in effect, Christianity really is a set of morals that have been laid down through the biblical text. And as soon as you say we're going to separate ourselves from everyone else and have our own little version of it, well, then you start that process, and you can then get to the point at which the second stage is what you say, where we have the revealed light in the temple, and the third one is the leader at the top says what goes.
I really do. I really come to a strong sense, even in the last couple of years, that it really was faulty at the foundation. I mean, what it has become is a far cry from what J&T envisioned, but the theology was faulty, I believe, just fundamentally, which allowed for this to grow into what it is. I mean, the fruits, give a sign of what the tree is.
Yeah, look, it's probably beyond the scope of where we want to go in this discussion, because I suspect that we could have a very interesting, deep and detailed theological discussion about those aspects of it. But all I'll say is this: that when I went and studied theology, and I did, various very fascinating subjects, the exegesis of the Old Testament and the history of the New Testament and the way in which the biblical text was formed, etc., you just come to a realization that really the brethren's understanding and they have this mistaken view that they know more about it than anybody else. But you very quickly realize that they actually know a lot less than most, and they don't actually have very much of a large picture understanding of what the whole thing is about. But when you're inside, of course, you can't reach that view. I just want to talk, Cheryl, about the trapping aspect of it, because my brother Richard, who I'm sadly no longer with us, would you believe, due to asbestosis. So I've lost two brothers to the same condition. When my brother Richard left, he was in a very similar position, I suspect, to most, where he had a mortgage on his house owed to other brethren. So their house, instead of borrowing money from a bank, money borrowed from senior brethren. And of course, as soon as you leave, they call it in, because the mortgage is available at call. But, in the way that life turns, what happened was the amount of his mortgage, within a few weeks of him finding out he was going to get his mortgage called, his neighbour called him up and said, "We would like to buy some of your backyard." And they actually paid out his mortgage by buying a small portion of his backyard. Now, you can put whatever context you like around that. And I'm easy with any interpretation or reason or motivation you like to put around it. But it just shows that you don't limit yourself. Yeah. Don't think I can't do it because of X. There are always ways around it. And whether you look at it as though God provided for him, or whether you look at it as though that is just because he took an opportunity that presented itself, I don't mind which way you look at it. I'm not going to try and say either way works. And I'm going to tell another poignant story about my brother Richard for you. So after he left, he had he and his wife Jenny had another son, Charles. when he was 20 months old, he became ill. He was perfectly fine, healthy, 20-month-old little boy, curly white hair, chatting, walking. He could not have faltered a thing. And one Sunday night, we went to the gospel meeting, as we used to do. And when we picked him up, he actually slept in the cot in my bedroom in my parents' house, and we picked him up to take him home, and he coughed. And we thought that's a little bit unusual. And then within 5 days, he was gone.
Oh, wow.
And of course, you would know what was said about that.
Yeah.
But then fast forward to the other story that I mentioned to you more recent, that happened some years later, where my other brother's grandson was killed in an accident. And nobody is from our side, from the outside the brethren, is going to attribute that to God's justice or wrath or whatever. It's a tragic accident. It's what happens in life. Things go wrong in life.
Yeah.
There are things that go wrong in life. So you can't expect, if you leave, that you will never have a problem. There will be issues, but it's not God's judgment. That's not how God works. And it's just so wrong to attribute those things to some sort of vendetta or attributive justice as a result. And I just wanted to make that point, because we all know of people who have left, who've had tragic things happen or great things happen. And when they happen inside the brethren, such as happens to people inside as well, then it's what's called vicarious suffering. So it's suffering imposed upon them by somebody to make up for others' transgressions. Well, that's just nonsense. It really is nonsense, and it needs to be called for what it is.
And on the flip side of that, they never admit that anyone such as yourself who's had a successful life, they don't say, "Oh, well, that's God's blessing," do they? I mean, logically, no. If they're to say that something bad happening is God's judgment, then they're bound to admit that the converse is true as well. Surely,
yeah, it's exactly right. Exactly right. And in my own experience, where I've had such an interesting and fulfilled life, I don't attribute that to God blessing me because I left.
No, but I'm just saying from their point of view.
Not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is if you make the decision to leave, you've got choices. And one of those choices is to do the sort of things that you want to do.
Yeah, and I think what both of you are saying is, it's the whole sort of thing, going back to J&D, is predicated on the negative, and it's predicated on judgment over love, or judgment over mercy. Like it's all the negative. It's you have to separate from, this is God's judgment on. This is and it's not really focused on the love. As a Christian, the love that's seen in Christ, or the love that's the message of the gospel.
It's just so.
I think what I struggled with after I left, I also left at 17, is I didn't know how to make choices, right? Like I left, and then there's this wide world. And I do know that this is something we struggle when we talk to some of the insiders that are still in there, is they simply don't know how to make a choice. It's because you've had everything made, all your decisions are made for you. You follow regime. You are indoctrinated to be this robotical human for the leader. And once you leave, it is hard. It's hard to even know. If I had to work through therapy on how to make choices. So what I would give an offer for the insiders that are listening to this, again, is it's like trying on clothes. You just have to do things. You've got to rebuild your trust in your own human instinct. And when you get out here, you're going to know what to do. You'll know what to do. And just like Tom said, It's like those experiences come to you. The people come to you. The jobs come to you. It literally comes to you. Your job is just to take that leap of faith and fly out of the cage. I will promise you, there's so many of us out here, and we all help each other in making choices. But I do know that is an issue more so now than maybe even when I left, or when you even left, Tom, is that it's hard for them to even know if they're making choices. They're very, very brainwashed in there now.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, building on that, Cheryl, is that, again, if we're speaking in a Christian context, the work of God is different in every person. And the way you might experience the Christian faith is different than I might, how we express it. And trying things on and working in different, or attending or being a part of different groups, and you find where you connect with God or where you can feel this synergy is important. I think it really is.
Yeah. And I mean, that first step out, right? It is very, especially when you've been in a faith-based community, that it is so important to try on what fits you. I have tried on so many different things. I tried on Catholicism. I tried on the United Church. I tried on so many different churches. I tried on different spiritual modalities. I've tried on everything. And you know what I've come back to at age 40? I don't even know how old I am. 48, 49. I'm not sure what I am. I think I'm 49. What I've come back to is, due to the trauma and stuff that I've experienced, my faith has led me back to myself. That it comes back to me getting back inside everything that I've experienced and learning how to have that trust within myself. Do I have trust within my choices? Do I have trust within who is around me? Do I have, it's really, we've got to come back to that solid faith and trust in yourself. And then once you get to figure that out, when you try on other things, it is much easier. You can really find what fits you. But I've been out 30 years and I'm just really learning how to do this now, only because I've just really dove in to some of the most deepest trauma that I've gone through. Up until now, it's just this constant trying on. Nothing really fit. Nothing doesn't feel right. And so the more that I have dove into what happened to me in there, is the more that I'm finally feeling content with myself. And I mean, I do a lot of healing on this podcast. It is very, very therapeutic for me when I come in on here and we connect together. To me, it fills my bucket and the wounds of my soul more than anything that I can put words to. And so I think it's important, with the abundance of opportunities and choices that we have in the world, you got to learn how to just try things on. And those are when you make your choices, right? Find people that you connect with. You'll find a lot of people that you have a special kinship with out here.
That's exactly right. Can I talk about one anecdote? When we left, as I've already said, we were very very adherent to the rules, etc. And so I had never heard any music other than brethren singing hymns, and never heard a radio, never heard a pre-recorded music or anything like that. A year or two after we left, my brother Richard said, "I'm going to buy a record player," which in those days was there were no CDs in those days. And so he bought an HMV 8+8, which is a fairly basic stereo. And I get a bit emotional talking about this, because it introduced me to one of the greatest loves of my life. And he rang up, and I remember saying, "It's been delivered. Why don't you come around and have a look?" So we went around, and there, sitting in his lounge room, was this stereo. Had a radio, and he had a 33 LP record by a couple called Joel and Labreska Hemphill. And he said, "Have a listen to this." And he put it on, and last night, in thinking about this, I could still remember the words of the very first song that I ever heard. And it was, Lord, I give myself to thee, heart and soul and all of me. Make me what I ought to be. I'm willing, Lord. Willing, Lord, to take thy word to foreign soil or spend a life at home with thee. And I remember hearing that song played and just thinking, what possibly could be wrong about that? That is, that is like the gospel message of Christianity encapsulated in the most beautiful country. It was country and Western music, I'm sorry to have to say. And I have moved on in my taste a little bit since then, but I still go back to that moment of the Hawaiian guitar and the drums and this deep South American voice. What that started in my life was just this passion for high quality stereo music, which those who know me would know that I have the most ridiculous hi-fi system and have a massive collection of music of all sorts. And it is just a beautiful, beautiful thing to have really good quality music. And if you're the sort of person who maintains that, the creation is God's doing, which, I fully accept, that is part of it. That is part of it. And music is a beautiful thing, and don't be limited in what you listen to or be told what you should listen to. Just enjoy it. Choose to enjoy it.
What do you think? I mean, you've obviously been watching all the podcasts. What do you think it will take for change to happen in there? There's many, many people that are waiting for what they call a second Aberdeen. I don't think it's going to happen the way that Aberdeen happened. It's not. I just don't believe in that. But what do you think it will take for either an opening for people to leave or things to shift in there, in your opinion?
See, it's a difficult question to answer. I know when we left in 1970, we developed a thesis, if you like, that about every 10 years there was a crisis. And we were sort of predicting that there would be one roughly every 10 years coming on, and one of those would be so significant that it would result in the disintegration of it. But here we are, 50 years later, and it still hasn't happened. I'm not sure that it will disintegrate. I'm not sure that it will. I feel like now it's become this self-fulfilling monolith, which people are so... I mean, why would Bruce let it disintegrate? Why wouldn't he simply keep the control, keep the financial control over it, keep the personal control over it, and modify a little bit here and there? I really think if you're going to wait until it disintegrates, you're probably never going to leave.
And it comes down to knowing that you have a choice, right? And even though that choice is scary, you've got to ask. There's just so many people with one foot in, one foot out, just waiting for some moment to open up. And yeah. I understand that. I completely understand wanting a door to open for you. But sometimes we have to put our hand on that handle and open the door for ourselves. And to me, in my personal opinion, I think that's how the change is going to happen, is that it's each individual person has to learn how to stand up and pursue what they know that they deserve.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think each person is in control of their own lives. And although it might be daunting and it might be very confronting to think about it, there are steps that you can take, which, I don't remember which podcast it was, but I think there was a recent podcast where someone was suggesting, I mean, you can go to a service station and buy yourself what we would call a burner phone and get yourself access to the outside world so much easier now than you could when we were young. And you get that access, and then you start to find out what is actually happening out there, and you'll find out that you're being sold a lie, that it's not the truth, that this is the beginning and end of the world inside the brethren. There is, you can choose, if you wish, to move on.
Yeah.
And go and get a life.
And people can follow that advice that you got from your scuba diving thing as well. If they want to leave in 5 years' time or whatever, then what do they need to do in a year's time, and so on, and think about it.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, it's just the constant reiteration from those of us who have learned it, but it's that whole thing is just not true. I mean,
yeah.
I'm going to read this email, and then I'm going to let you comment, Bradley. So we received an email from an insider, and it's one of the reasons why I've really wanted to go down this road with, we just put out Paul's podcast, and what was such timing when Tom emailed. So Bruce, this is the email. Brucey raised the subject of Aberdeen again recently. He must find it a real threat if he keeps talking about it. Anyway, he was quite worked up, virtually yelling things like, there was no evidence and people believed a lie. So Brucey, I have a question for you. Let's put aside whether anything lewd did or didn't happen. However, it certainly looked like something lewd happened and therefore had the appearance of evil. And haven't PBCC members been booted out in the past for doing things that had the appearance of evil? It just doesn't pass the sniff test, Brucey. People do have eyes, ears, and brains, They can work this stuff out and see it for what it is. And if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and sounds like a duck.
Yeah. Look, if I was, if I had the opportunity of having a typical sort of what we would call a cross-examination of the witnesses at Aberdeen, I would love that. Unfortunately, some of those are probably no longer with us. I'm not sure who's still around that was here on those days, but if you look at the first-hand reports, there's no doubt about the fact that they were both in the same bed together. There's no doubt about, I think it's even conceded that there was no clothes being worn, at least by Madeline.
Well, she acknowledges it in that statement she gave to the court in the Netherlands. I mean,
correct,
openly. Yeah,
and was that the Dutch book case?
and the concept of an ambush. I mean, that was an invention after the fact. Mm-hmm. The fact is, nobody expected him to say that it was an ambush because, he was in the end stages of alcoholism. He died only about 2 or 3 months after that.
And he had ample, his power was absolute. This idea that he had to draw people out and he had to create this whole situation to get rid of, he could have gotten rid of anybody.
Yeah.
At the drop
Absolutely.
of a hat.
Yeah.
I mean, it just at will. I mean, it doesn't pass the sniff test. It really doesn't.
We've had insiders tell us that Bruce is talking about the same thing, that he's going to find a way to draw the opposers out and the people in there that aren't following him. And I'm like, he does all this stuff that sets him up in case something happens, right? We know that the whole Aberdeen incident, I mean, not even just the Aberdeen incident, years before, this all is, he knows it's the biggest flaw in the foundation that he sets his church on top of, right? So it is one of those things that is very passionate for me to keep exploiting, keep bring the people on. Let's get talking about this so that those inside there can really realize that, yes, this did happen. And that point on from J2 Junior, when everything was exploited, to me, set the stage for everything that has happened since, including what I went through. I truly believe that I would have not went through and suffered what I went through had it been completely dealt with at JT Junior's time, had it been brought up, had he been dealt with and the real truth been dealt with the way that it should have been dealt with. I don't think we'd be having account after account after account after account of these horrible stories that have happened. To me, he made it okay to have things covered up, to lie, to protect the testimony, create these false false realities that are just that cover
Fake
up
news.
such horrible things that have happened.
So let me tell you about when the last time I met JD Jr. in Adelaide. He came and he took meetings in Adelaide, and of course, I think it was during school time, so we had to knock off school early and go, et cetera, et cetera. And anyway, he turned up. He was obviously drunk. He was slurring his speech, and he kept on saying this phrase, it's about time we took off our straitjackets. He kept on saying, it's about time we took off our straitjackets. And as a young 16-year-old, of course, that sounded fabulous to me. I mean, it sounded like he was about to say we don't have to have so many rules, that we can be a little bit more flexible. Anyway, and I should mention, I don't want to say who this person is because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but I'd been very close friends with a Brethren girl for a long time, and I'm sure we both thought we were going to get married probably as soon as we turned 18. And so I've told you about the car accident, and after the car accident, it was her father, who was one of the senior people, said something like that I'd had it coming to me for a while, I think is the words that he used apparently. So I was a little bit concerned about that, and then the father had found out that the girl and I had exchanged photographs, which of course was a complete taboo topic. So we had to give the photographs back. And anyway,
we should say though, let's just be clear for those that do not understand the PBCC, that these would have just been like they're not like X-rated photos. These are just. Hell no. I could see people's minds going. These are not X-rated photos. These will just be like.
We're not sending each other photos on a phone. These are black and white, tiny little portraits of a face. Which was just marvelous for me to have this photo of this gorgeous girl, and presumably I hope she felt the same. Anyway, I'll get to the point. So JD Jr. said this thing about the straitjackets, you see, and about 3 or 4 months later, in one of those curious twists of life, my Mr. Bales, the Bales I talked about earlier, he had a daughter who had married and was living in Sydney, who was about to have her first child. And so Mrs. Bales wanted to go to Sydney to be with her daughter who had to have her first child, but it meant that she would be away for the ministry meeting, for the Tuesday night ministry meeting. And in those days, I don't know whether it's still the same, but in those days, the ministry meeting was, what was it called? The clarion call or something or other. Everyone had to be at your home assembly for the ministry meeting every Tuesday night. And so he asked for permission. He got up he spoke in a reading meeting and said, he wanted to ask the brethren, would it be okay if she went to Sydney and stayed there for a week, so she'd be away for the ministry meeting? And there was all this debate going on about it, we need to be committed to the testimony and all those sort of phrases. And because I was a very enthusiastic young brother, and I basically could quote fair slabs of the Bible off by heart, etc. So I just picked up the microphone and I said, quoting JD Jr., who had the week or two earlier, or maybe a little longer, I said, isn't it about time we took off our straitjackets? Now that was a seminal moment in my Brethren history, because it could have gone either way. It could have been this, this is the words of the wise young man, or it could have been you naughty boy, and it was the latter. Somebody, one of the leader brothers, picked up the microphone and said, that's just a very cheeky and rude thing to say, and it shows how far away from where you are you should be, etc. This is to a 16-year-old young man. So I immediately at that stage, my first reaction, of course, was that might have jeopardized my chances of actually maintaining my relationship and getting married to this girl, but in the way things happen, that might have been a good thing, because when Dad decided to leave, I wasn't, we hadn't spoken to each other for 2 or 3 months or something because of that incident. But talking about the JT Jr. sort of, he could say something like that. And everyone would go, yeah, we understand I don't know what he actually meant, but you couldn't repeat it yourself, because if you repeated it yourself, you were being cheeky and rude. I don't understand, no one understands the logic of these things. And the fact is that the world leader just lives in a complete vacuum of rationality and can make those sort of statements without any judgment or justification. And I presume Bruce is the same, that whatever he says goes, and he doesn't have to justify it or rationalise it in any way whatsoever.
Yeah, in one of those first-hand accounts of Aberdeen, this one brother said that JT Jr. had been saying, "I can do things no one else can do," which is exactly what you're saying, and it's only gotten stronger, I think.
Oh. And again, I just make my statement. It's like, to me, it just goes back to them. It goes back to JT Jr.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stones were loose in the foundation at the beginning, but it really, JT Jr.'s whole demise really let the thing blossom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's where the gas was poured on the fire.
Turned into the poison ivy that it's become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Snarling and snaking around and choking.
So the Tuesday night ministry meeting when Dad said he was leaving, then the Wednesday night when Richard withdrew from the entire Adelaide Brethren, which was a fairly strong decision and a high tense, high drama moment. But as Richard walked out, the words "we withdraw from Richard Grace" were uttered by Gar Gooden, one of the leading young brothers in Adelaide. So when we got home, here's me, a Brethren boy who's always obeyed every single possible rule, not quite sure what's going on, and then Dad and Mum say, "Oh, Richard and his family are coming for dinner on tomorrow night, on Thursday night." And I remember thinking, what are we going to do when it comes time to eat? Because he's withdrawn from. And this moment is indelibly engraved in my mind, where we sat down at the green Laminex kitchen table in 1970. Richard's there, Dad's there, I'm there, Mum's there, Richard's wife Jenny's there. And I looked at my dad and I thought, we're going to eat food with someone who's withdrawn from. And I just couldn't believe that we were going to do it. And Dad picked up his fork and started to eat. And nothing happened. It was fine. Nothing happened. It was absolutely nothing happened. Nothing changed. And that was kind of the very first Brethren rule I'd ever broken, I suppose. And it's been a series of rules since. But the fact is, the Brethren rules are just complete nonsense. They don't actually matter.
What would you say to the insiders in there that get really hung up on the rules in there, but still have one foot in, one foot out? How would you say, what would you say to them to help them start unraveling that so it can give them to be able to get that next foot out?
Well, I think the question you'd need to ask yourself is, if you're a committed Christian, which some I gather some inside would definitely be, then go and have a look and see whether in fact the Bible says exactly what that rule is supposed to be.
That's a very good answer.
Is there something in the Bible that says that, or is that just Bruce's idea of what the Bible says?
Mm-hmm. Because
I will guarantee there's no verses in the Bible that talk about, not wearing a tie. I remember when that ministry came in and it would, be done with the ties of nature. I mean, seriously, what a perversion of interpretation is that? That's just ridiculous nonsense. All of these rules about, there are hundreds of them. They are man-made rules. They're made up by somebody who is in power and able to do so. And to be perfectly frank about it, the reason they make new rules and they keep changing rules is so that they have power over you. They want you to have to jump when they say jump, and they want you to change when they say change. That's why the Lord turns a corner. God doesn't turn corners. God's consistent. If God is a straightforward, omniscient, omnipotent being, he doesn't turn corners. That's rubbish. That's what I
think I actually am going to read a little excerpt out of an email I got. This is another email that we had come in that they gave me permission to read out. I'm just going to read just a short excerpt of it. And what this person is talking is they're talking about how there's no talk of Christianity in there. You don't bring up the word God or Jesus. When people do, they look at you funny. And let me just find where I can start here. I feel like the conversation goal is getting further and further away from what's really important, to the point where it's now out of control and being fueled by people propped up as successful, influential, close to our brother, for everyone to follow after, take directions from. There is no getting back to basics now. The simple things that matter most have been left in the dust. I have a hard time recalling a time where someone genuinely impromptu spoke raw and openly from their heart of their faith, spiritual experiences in a casual setting, unscripted. I guess people just don't have those conversations in social settings. Where is our faith? Why isn't it talked about? Is it alone in Jesus? What really matters? Who am I serving? I find strength in honestly asking myself these questions. The answers are so easy when put it in simple terms. One thing that is so true is that you can't see through it until one day you start to, and then you can't unsee it. But then what to do next? Stay with your broken soul or leave, breaking the hearts of your family as well as your own on the way out. And so this email, I mean, it was quite lengthy. I just gave an excerpt of it. It just broke my heart in the sense that, right, those Christians that are in there, that their souls are seeking that juice in their life, are being starved of it, and it's being replaced with this robotic man that doesn't fulfill what true Christians are looking for, Yeah.
And my dad, that's the reason that my dad made the decision to leave, because the beloved, JT Jr., was being talked about more than the Lord Jesus. And I remember having this conversation with these two boys that were in my year 12 class with me, who were brethren boys. And I said, that's the reason we're leaving. And one of them came back. He did come back to me and speak to me about a week later, I reckon. And he said, last night at the reading meeting, I counted, and there were 19 references to the Lord Jesus and 14 references to the beloved. So I'm going to stay. And I remember thinking at the time, what a strange way in which to make your decision. But it sounds like, from what you've just said, as if the score might be slightly different these days.
Oh, I think the score is very different. Yeah, I think the score is very different nowadays. Yeah. I invite those that listen to our podcast, we know there's a lot of them, to just start seeding that you have a choice. Like, when you go about your day, just ask yourself of, like, what choices are yours and what choices are from the PBCC community. Which ones are yours, and what would you be doing? Just ask yourself, what would you be doing? What choices would you make differently if you weren't in there? What would those choices make? Just let yourself start thinking just like that. And I love that exercise. I think everybody should do the exercise Tom spoke about. I mean, what an incredible way to, like, where do you see yourself 10 years from now? What do you want? Yeah. I really think that is something that each and every one of us should sit down and do. And it just gives us a little mirror into checking the freedom that we've left for, and those that are wanting to leave for some freedom.
Yeah. And I said before we started to record that there's a film that I watched a few years ago. It's dated now, called Shawshank Redemption. And it's a film about a chap who's in prison and stays in prison and then is released towards the end of his life. And I'm not going to spoil the end of it, but it's very similar to where I started today, in terms of the story about the sulphur-crested cockatoo, that if you stay too long and you don't make the choice, it can get to the point where you won't exist outside. You're just not going to be able to adapt. But that's my dad was 61 when he left, and he never really changed his theological stance, but he did really have an enjoyable life after he left, even at 61. So people can make a late decision, but in my experience as a now 70-year-old, just do it. Just start, make the step. Write down the 10-year goal, write down the 5-year goal, start, go and buy the burner phone if you need to, find out what it's like, start to make some, contacts with people outside. And I've over my period since I left, I've had young people who've left that have come and seen me, and we've sat down and had coffee together. And I know of at least 2 who have, as a result of having a chat to me and hearing my story, have gone, do you know what? I'll go back to uni too. And awesome. I know of 2 who have done that, who now have professional careers. One of whom is a descendant of one of my good friends at school. I think that's a lovely sort of circle back. And certainly if there are people who want to chat about it, I'm open to do that.
I was going to say, Tom, like the fact that you studied later in life, not just obviously you studied when you were sort of 18, I suppose, at that technical college, but the fact that you then studied law later in life also shows, those that might be thinking of leaving, that it is possible to do that. Things might not come quite as easily as you get older, because you tend to be slower at picking things up, don't you, the older you get, but it is possible. And
I'm not sure that I'm not sure it does actually get harder, Paul, because what I found was that when I went to uni, and I at the same, when I did my law degree, I was running a business and I had 4 teenage sons. So it was hard work.
Yeah.
But the fact is that when you're an adult and you're coming to it with a mature mindset, you tend to do what needs to be done, and you don't do what doesn't need to be done. So you probably don't spend a lot of time at the pub drinking with the other students. You perhaps that time you might spend doing what you need to do to survive, but you can do it, and these days, of course, you can do it online. There's a lot of courses. You can even study law online,
and there's even free. There's lots of free courses as well. Yeah. I mean, because one of the things that might be a barrier is the fact that you might have to pay for it if you're giving up a highly paid job inside and can only get something menial outside. That might be a fear that people have. But that is so. But again, for example, in my instance, once I finished my law degree, and I don't think I had a lot of confidence about what I was going to do when I finished my law degree. And when I was nearly finished, I had my building business going at the time. I remember one of the clients I was building for, when he found out that I was nearly finished a law degree, he said to me, "You realise you're going to be able to get a job pretty quickly as a lawyer?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." But I got a job at a high-end law firm straight away. In Australia, when you finish your law degree, you have to do 6 weeks working in a law firm, usually for no pay. And so I applied at this high-end law firm on advice from somebody, one of the judges, actually, friends, who, would you believe, was a Mormon, a Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the chap I knew who was a Mormon said, "Oh, look, I know this judge." And so these are the connections that you don't even realise these things are going to happen. And so he said, "This is the law firm you should approach." So I approached them, and they said yes. And I went there. And 2 days after I started on my free 6-week career there, which I thought was going to be 6 weeks, they came and said, "Would you like a job?" And I was like, "What?" I didn't expect to have that offer straight away. But the fact that you are coming with a set of good values, and whatever you've done in the past in terms of your experience will be valuable in your new career, whatever it is you choose. And they offered me the job, and I did really well there. And I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but if you Google online, if you get a burner phone and Google online, you'll see I'm now recognised as
one of the three preeminent lawyers in South Australia in construction law. That's simply because of that seminar that I went to, 30 odd years ago, where this chap said to me, set yourself a goal, and I did it. And I started to work towards it. And I had knockbacks. It's not as if I got in the first time. I got knocked back from 3 or 4 times, I think it was, and eventually got in. The hardest part was actually getting in, to be honest. Once I got in, I found it relatively straightforward. The study and the concept of learning and stuff in my 40s, I found that was fine.
And I think the point to make out is that you got to choose what you were passionate about. I mean, we hear all the time about the UBT seminars that are happening inside the PBCC church and all these businessmen that have to go to them. You sit back and you wonder where all the lawyers and the doctors and the veteran, like all these different other careers that they probably would be passionate about doing it, and yet they're stuck building their own business. Right. Yeah. And so I think, again, I invite those insiders that are listening to think about what you're passionate about, right? Not just what you're building this, magnificent business, but to think about what you're actually passionate about. Because I believe that inside the PBCC is probably a doctor waiting to come out, a lawyer waiting to be built. It's more than just about making money. It's about following your passion and having choices. And I think, Tom, you've described it beautifully with everything that you were able to choose from the age of 17 on, right? Even though you got sidestepped into your own little group that was like the Rentons, but you still had choice within that.
Yeah. Well, we actually only, like, my first wife and I, we stayed there until our first son was born. And there's a choice that we made as well. Because we were in this very small group of about 20, 25, by that time, about 25 people, I suppose. And I remember when my first son was born, we talked about it and we just thought, do you know what? We don't want to bring our son up in a really small group like that and limit his choices about his friends. And so we went and joined what's known as the Open Brethren, which you would know in Brethren history is a split back in the late 19th century. And we were there for a number of years, and they were lovely, lovely people. They really were lovely people. And then after that was when I went through I learnt the New Testament, most of the New Testament off by heart, because I was so passionate in my Christianity, and I became a very, very, very avid Christian, if you like, even much more committed than I had been at any other stage in my life. And then we moved to a Baptist church after that. And again, beautiful community of people. And then various things occurred and we moved on from there. But you do have those choices, and there are just so many welcoming communities that will support and embrace you if you're prepared to take the step.
Thank you so much for coming on. I so appreciated you taking the time to send the email you did. It was very thorough. You articulated it so well that I didn't even know who you were. I was like, we need to book him in. So I appreciate you coming on here and being so vulnerable and allowing us a little piece and look into your life. And I know, and hopefully it will inspire some insiders to reevaluate their choices and maybe feel what they're passionate about more than what's in there, and know that they can step out. Everybody is here, that you're able to reach out to any of us here. If you're looking for more help, you can contact the Olive Leaf Network or info.getalife@proton.me. But there is a lot of help and support out here. And I thank you once again, Tom, for coming on and sharing this with us. Thank you so much.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much. And I often think, if there were 150 direct descendants of my grandmother in 1970, how many would there be now?
Yeah.
So there would be a lot of extended family inside, and there are a few I know who have left, but there are many, many, many more who have not. And I guess my hope is that they might see this and go, "That's what I could do." And if there's any that would like to do that, I'd be very happy to sit down and have a cup of coffee with them.
And you're readily available on social media, like people can find you, or do you have an email?
Facebook is where you'll probably find me the easiest. But certainly, if you Google my name, Tom Grace, lawyer in Adelaide, my email address and my mobile phone number's there. So
perfect. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Bradley, for showing up, and Paul for supporting this. Thank you so much. Until next time, everyone. Much love to you all. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
If you are in a high-demand religious group and need help, please go to oliveleaf.network. To share your story or be a guest on the show, email info.getalife@proton.me. Please remember to like this video, subscribe to Get a Life, and comment.